This is a conversation that takes place around a number of questions that we will raise. And of course, the presenters know that they should be direct to the questions and together about 7 minutes on each question. So the very first question here, let me see if I can scroll this up, ask who you are, what you believe, and why. Could you share your partisan and faith stories? How did you come to be affiliated and active in the political party of which you are a member? And how and why did you become a Christian? And either of you could start. We start with the simple ones first.
Boy, no softballs tonight. Well, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here and to be here with these two people, especially for what I hope is a great dialogue and great conversation tonight. I'll note that we are not wearing the appropriate colors for the parties that we represent, because I would have worn the red and Andrew would have worn the blue tonight. But this is part of our reconciliation process that we're already going through. You know, I didn't grow up a Christian. My parents were immigrants from Taiwan and came to the United States. As Dr. Henderson mentioned, we lived in North Carolina, and either there was a cultural Christianity about living in North Carolina. I'm sure many of you who were in the South, who've spent time in the South, understand what I'm talking about. So we went to church, but we weren't Christians, really. And in fact, I spent most of my life through schooling in high school and in college as I would say as a seeker. I was always curious intellectually about the life of Jesus Christ. I was curious about the spiritual elements of Christianity and the faith, but never more than that. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I became a Christian. And I became a Christian after a great tragedy came to my life. Someone very close to me passed away in a drowning accident. And it was from that dark place that God found me. And so my faith came very late. And it actually postdated my political affiliation, because I was a Republican before I was a Christian. And now I can say I'm both. I think that my faith in Jesus has required me to take stock of my own political views and to really question and pressure test, if you will, the views that I've had and the beliefs that I have in politics. I'll just say that growing up, I grew up in the era of Reagan and then George H.W. Bush, and at a time when they were very formative in my own political beliefs. And so really the answer to why I became a Republican was because I saw Reagan and I saw Bush on TV. I thought they were pretty cool. And so I thought, okay, I'm probably a Republican. Fortunately, as time has gone on, I've been able to refine that answer a little bit in terms of my own belief and my own understanding. But let me just conclude by saying this. I think people of good conscience and who believe in Jesus Christ can differ in their political views. I don't believe that there is a single right answer. I heard once this saying, and I think it's really true: politics is human, but God is divine. And at the end of the day, to believe that one's religious beliefs strictly dictate their political beliefs is a misapprehension of the Scripture. I think it's a misapprehension of what Jesus taught us during his ministry here on earth. And I believe that it unfortunately conflates two things that really shouldn't be conflated, and that's politics and faith. So anyway, that's where I come from.
Thank you.
So my faith story is somewhat different. Both of my parents grew up in churches, and when I was about 6 months old, my mother started to seek more deeply. And she came to a personal faith in Jesus Christ, and it transformed, I guess, the rest of our lives. I would still say my dad is at best nominally Christian, but because of her influence, she taught me Scripture, she took me to church, and when I was a very small child, she led me to the plan of salvation. And so I accepted Christ as a really, really small child. At the basis of my understanding at that such young age, I was accepting Christ because I didn't want to go to hell. Understood hell was a bad place, didn't want to go there. Jesus died for my sins. Okay, I could accept that, and I believed and I took that. on as my faith. Of course, as time went on and I got older, I began to understand more and more of my faith. So as I hit developmental milestones, I also made recommitments to Christ, and committed myself to Christ in ways that I could understand as a teenager and as a college student, in ways that I think are important to recognize. So even when somebody accepts Christ as a young age, they accept it with the 6-year-old brain or 5-year-old brain, or in my case, a nearly 4-year-old brain. And then there was understanding what I was doing by the time I got to be in my late teens. My partisan story is, in fact, an interesting story. So if you looked at me, you would assume I'm a college professor, I'm African American. Of course, I must be a Democrat. And you're right about 90% of the time. But that's actually not quite the whole story. So I grew up the road in Richmond. So as I might like to put it, halfway between, or almost halfway between Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell growing up. So growing up on the tail end of the Bible Belt meant that I certainly got a lot of gospel, but that I also got a lot of Republican Party politics. And unlike everybody else at church, I found out on my pastor's wife's deathbed that they were Democrats, and that kind of blew my mind. I was like, how can you be? I grew up in a household where my parents, and can never quite be sure exactly where my mother is, but I think she votes Republican most of the time, and my dad is definitely a Republican. So I was one of those rare breeds who grew up in a black Republican household. It was college before I realized that most black people hated Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, because he was cool with me, like jelly beans. I was a little kid, it all made sense to me. And in 1996, when I was able to vote for the first time in an election, I voted for Bob Dole. Did not vote for Bill Clinton. Couldn't vote for him. He was an adulterer. And so that certainly sort of shaped my mind. But when I went to college, I had friends who challenged me about racial issues. And particularly, I started to think about structural racism and all of those kinds of issues. And it became a little bit more untenable for me to sort of continue.
Let me just encourage both of you to turn your microphones on.
Oh.
This would be good.
Yeah, it became a little bit more untenable for me I'm gonna have to pull this off in order to see where everything is out there. Okay. It became a little bit more untenable for me to continue to identify with the Republican Party. I started to see what inequality was like. I started to become aware that not all inequality was based in personal decisions or personal mistakes or lack of responsibility, that I began to see that government maybe had a role to play in reducing inequality and addressing certain structural issues that they had put into place in the first place. And that seemed somewhat incompatible with a Republican Party identification. Now, there are some ways that I still look, think, and act like a Republican. So the church that I go to, I know is overwhelmingly Republican. I'm still socially conservative. If culturally speaking, I would much rather party at a Republican National Convention than a Democratic National Convention, because at least there'll be Christian singers at the Republican National Convention and they won't be at the Democratic National Convention. So I have friends who have tried to pull me aside and question my dating practices when I've dated Republicans. So there are all these ways in which I'm kind of weird, but I'm comfortable in my decision to be a Democrat, especially right now. And I also think that, that could change the same way that I changed in college. There is, nothing to say that in the future that the parties might take policy positions that on the whole I find incompatible with what I think is the right thing to do. And yes, my faith will inform that, but there are also other things that inform my policy preferences. Self-interest informs my policy preferences. Sometimes common sense, sometimes trust in certain officials and leadership could also inform that as well. So, I'm probably, in political science, I'm one of those people who tends to veer more toward you kind of stick with the party and stay with it, but actually in my behavior, I do act rationally, and am willing, at least hypothetically speaking, to switch my party identification if I think the party leaves me.
Okay, very good. And but don't pay attention to those on the dating thing. They're in the know-nothing party, so they don't know. Okay, now this event that we're attending is entitled, How Would Jesus Vote? But there's a question of whether or not Jesus was politically active in his day. How do you view Jesus' engagement with the authorities and society in his context? And how do Jesus' politics impact your own?
So I think that that's an interesting question. Historically speaking, as I understand it, when people in Jesus' day were looking for a Messiah, they were looking for a political leader, and they were disappointed in Jesus because he turned out not to be the political leader that they were hoping for. So they were looking for somebody who was going to free them from Roman rule. And that wasn't what Jesus was about. And that's something that I'm actually very, very mindful of when I think about my politics. And I especially think about politics in light of the fact that on the Christian left, we tend to emphasize the social gospel a lot. And so sometimes my view of the social gospel is that it's much more social than it is gospel. And so I think the lesson of Jesus is to always make sure that what Jesus' purpose was to come here on earth to die for our sins, to be the ransom for our shortcomings, and to bring us back into right relationship with God. And so, when Jesus says, if I be lifted up from the earth, I'll draw all men unto me, that's not a political statement, though I think he cares about social conditions. I think he cares about politics. I think he cares about policy. I think we always have to remember that Jesus' primary goal for each and every one of us is to be in relationship with us. And so he's much more interested in relationship with us than who's ahead in the polls or whether Donald Trump is going to be the next president of the United States. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think that, Jesus actually turned down many opportunities for political leadership. And in fact, I think that was very frustrating to many in his time. The reality is that there are some paradoxes in Jesus' life. And, one of them may be that he talks about the importance of respect for the law and respect for government and for the authorities. There's this saying that you give to God what's God's and you give to Caesar what's Caesar's, right? Because he was trying to encourage people to pay their taxes as good citizens. Tax collectors had a really bad rep during that time. They probably still do now, but then they had a really bad rep. And so, I think basically, those are the, right, the IRS has tapped my phone. So anyway, I think that, I do think that on the one hand, Jesus was sort of had this sense about following authority and the importance of respecting government. But on the other hand, he also, his teachings are decidedly anti-legalistic. And so, working through this paradox, I think, is part of the challenge for Christians in the public square, is figuring out, well, how are we supposed to translate our faith into an understanding about how we relate to government? And what does it mean if we disagree with what our government is doing? Are we to follow Jesus' example in respecting the rule of law and respecting our leaders in that way? Or are we to, in fact, kind of push against the legalistic interpretation that requires us to do so? So I think it's it's a tough question. I don't know that there's a great answer.
What do you see as sort of the right relationship between politics and religious belief in the U.S. now?
Well, I don't think it's at a right relationship. I don't think we're at a good equilibrium where we are now. I think as a Christian, there are certain things that I have to think about, and sometimes I get challenged by relatives about those things. I think, one, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, I think is an admonishment to be a good citizen. There are other places in the Pauline letters that talk about making sure that you obey rulers, that you pray for them. And that's certainly a hard thing to do in a very polarized American society where the other side is always stupid. And that hasn't always been the case, but we are at a particular period and a particular moment in American society where people try to gain leverage over their political opposition by demonizing them. And I think as a Christian, the Bible says, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake has forgiven you. So we are supposed to model something different. And sadly, I think our political leaders, including those who name the name of Christ, don't do that. And that's deeply problematic. I think part of the other thing that we need to think about is the notion that one party has captured the evangelical community, and it's the white evangelical community. In particular, there should be, the same way Lanhee and I were talking before this about the potential utility of Republicans being in a position to be able to compete effectively for the minority vote, Democrats might want to consider ways to put themselves into position to be able to compete for the evangelical vote. And I don't think either party is where they could be in terms of reaching out to groups. So we see polarization on so many dimensions, and we need to be able to work through that. And I think the other thing that people need to think about, And I think we'll talk about this probably a little bit later, is that there are many things in American culture historically that have the veneer of Christianity but don't actually really reflect a true relationship with Jesus Christ. And politics has been one of those places where that has happened. And so I think that some people are using faith to try to justify political positions that really reflect somebody's self-interest. And I don't have any issue with self-interest. I would just rather that people be transparent about what is your self-interest. So it's not that the Bible said that you should have a 15% variable tax rate on capital gains. It's that you don't want to pay it. And that's okay for you to say, I don't want to pay that because I'd rather keep my money and buy a yacht or go buy a new pair of shoes or put my kid in college. That's fine. And you can say that without having to try to super spiritualize things that aren't.
Yeah, it's tough because so much of the dialogue feels like it's been imbued with faith, and I'm not sure. Sometimes it may be appropriate, other times it may not be. It's really hard to judge the sincerity of someone's faith, and I try not to do that because someone who proclaims a belief in Jesus as their Savior, I take them at their word, and it's so sometimes I think we can get into this game as Christians, particularly, of trying to figure out is this person's faith for real? Are they genuine? And it's that's between them and God. I try not to get into that at all. I do think it is really hard if you really sit down and you think about how do I think about all these different issues. It's very difficult to separate out your faith and your belief from how that, I think, informs your perspective on where you might stand on an issue. Now, it may be the case, as I said earlier, that people come out differently on issues, and it's a perfectly reasonable conclusion to draw one way or the other. But at the end of the day, I think, again, we have this little bit of a paradox, because on the one hand, faith informs who we are. It is so deeply a part of who we are that it's very difficult to separate faith from our politics. On the other hand, I feel like we almost have to be disciplined about it a little bit. We have to sort of get to a place where we can say, okay, these are my personal beliefs. They're informed by my personal faith. As a matter of public policy, is this the thing we want to do? And sometimes it's two different questions, and getting there can be really hard.
That's a good segue really to the next question, which is, what do you do when your personal convictions on a matter differ from that of your party or your candidate?
Well, that certainly happens to me a lot as a Christian in the Democratic Party, and I think it's a question of salience. And so the issues with which I disagree with the Republican or with the Democratic Party about on social issues happen to be not particularly salient to me, and sort of as a matter of policy, not salient in terms of the issues that I think are most important in terms of addressing. And so, so for me, I can kind of make distinctions between them. If I were a single issue voter, and I really only cared about a certain subset of issues, then this would be a big thing. But those happen to not be the issues that I think are most important. And so when I'm looking at the whole of issues, when I'm thinking about, caring for the environment, if I'm caring about reducing inequality, if I'm caring about trying to come up with a way to make education equitable in this country, those things that matter most to me, I happen to agree with the Democratic Party most on these issues. And so because I agree with the Democratic Party most on a wide range of issues about which I care about far more than I care about some other issues, I'm going to identify with the Democratic Party on those issues. Now, this actually came up in my job 10 years ago. So before I joined the faculty at Emory, I worked for Mark Mellman, who's a Democratic pollster. And at the time I joined the firm, John Kerry was his biggest client. So I got to work on the tail end of the Kerry campaign. And so after that election was over, we were working for candidates, and I think it was probably around December or so, somebody had made a really crass comment about Christians in a staff meeting, and the managing partner of my firm asked me if I would, if I felt comfortable working in this environment where I was the only black analyst. So there were blacks who worked in the administrative staff, but I was the only black person who was working on the analytics side of the firm. And I was like, there have been no racial issues in this place, but people have made some ugly comments about evangelicals, and his eyes popped out of his head like, oh my gosh, we hired one of them. And so then he starts going down the litany of issues with which I agreed and disagreed, and he found out that I am pro-life. I don't believe in abortion. And so he was like, well, most of our clients are pro-choice. And I was like, yeah. I was like, that's not all that they are. And so if they were just pro-choice candidates, yeah, I'd probably be uncomfortable working with them. But yeah, no, on the whole, I agree with these candidates, so I don't mind working for them. Well, it turns out when they were figuring out how to divvy out assignments, because different people got assigned to work on different accounts, there was a group, it was a consortium of pro-choice groups that were working together, and they were thinking of putting me on that account. And they might have put me on an account that would work with Emily's List, which is a pro-choice PAC that supports female candidates running for office. And so based on that particular decision, my bosses made the decision they weren't going to put me on something where sort of the dominant sort of trait of these groups was their stance on choice. So that was actually one, I really respect my boss. I still respect him to this day for making that decision, allowing me to not compromise my beliefs, and even simple things in his office. My boss is a conservative Jew who was very observant, and so he observed Jewish holidays, he observed the Sabbath, so he did not care that I went to church on Sunday mornings, so even though he'd make me work on Sunday afternoons, I could go to church on Sunday mornings. Had a Catholic colleague who was also very, very observant, and so we were at least allowed to take time off so that we could observe practices in our faith and keep our disciplines up. So, I'm not quite sure that every firm in DC was like that, but that was actually a very, very positive experience.
Well, we've actually anticipated the next question, but go ahead.
I think that in general, we're always going to run into situations because you're never going to be 100% on the same page with what the party platform is, or I've had situations where I've worked for political leaders where there are various issues where I might disagree with them, and I think part of the process is vocalizing that disagreement and trying to help them understand why my perspective might be different. And you know what, I have like a 0% conversion rate, so I'm obviously not a very convincing person, but in terms of politics, in terms of political views on various issues, I've never actually convinced a candidate or a political leader who I've worked with and had a disagreement on to kind of come into my direction. But at the very least, I feel like in every situation I've been in, I've had the opportunity to be heard. And to sort of help them understand, okay, this is kind of how I get to where I get to. And I think that that's important to have that airing and to have that opportunity, and also the ability to observe your faith in political context. You're right, sometimes it can be really hard, but I've always found a pretty significant tolerance for things like saying, look, there's a certain amount of time on Sunday mornings, I'm not going to be available because this is a really important thing to me.
You both have anticipated our next question, so we won't go there. But what's the biggest misconception that people have of you as Christian Republican or Christian Democrat? And a related question, why do you think that there's such a lack of civil discourse and cooperation in American politics today?
Well, Christian Republican's probably a little less unusual than Christian Democrat. What I would say is, more often than not, the response, I'm on a college campus, you're on a college campus, so I get this sometime. It's like, oh, you're one of those, so talk to me about what it's like to be one of those. And, I get that reaction from other members of the faculty, I get that reaction from students sometimes, I get that reaction from just, university administrators. Obviously it's sort of in the candor behind closed doors. I don't think that they would say that publicly. Maybe they would, I don't know. But, for me at least, it's always I see it as an opportunity to be able to bring some texture to what clearly doesn't have a lot of texture. I think people feel that all evangelical Republican folks think the same, and nothing could be further from the truth. I know lots of people who are evangelical Christians and who are Republicans but have different views on any number of different issues. And so for me at least, the big challenge is trying to show that texture and try to help people understand that it is not like I am following some rote set of instructions that if you are Christian and if you have this set of beliefs, then therefore you must be a Republican. I want to show them that there is some animating thought that goes between A and B. And I think that can be a really valuable experience for people, just sort of hearing like, okay, how do you reason through this issue? How do you arrive at the conclusion you arrive at, which may have been the conclusion that you were predestined to arrive at. But nonetheless, it's good to show a little bit of independent thought.
There are ways in which it doesn't come up. It probably comes up more in Christian circles, and it's not something that I bring up a lot, sometimes maybe because it is a little uncomfortable. So this was a situation I did not handle well. And so I had to go and confess stuff afterwards. But I remember one time being in a prayer meeting, and they asked people if you knew politicians to kind of like raise your hand, and I did, and I shouldn't have. Because all of a sudden I had this swarm of people who wanted to lay hands on me as though I was the proxy for the elected official, and then had the assistant pastor of the church walk up. Okay, so like, who do you know? And I knew I was getting ready to say all the wrong names. So I tried to like worm my way out of it, and I wasn't completely honest. And so I was like, Lord, I'm sorry, I lied. Because I knew, wrong church, like I was getting ready to list all the far left people, like, you know, that I knew in the Atlanta City Council and the Georgia State Legislature, and they were gonna start looking at me crazy. And I just didn't feel like having that fight that day. So I think probably for Christians, when you identify as a Democrat, in today's day and age, part of the reason why we're so polarized is that it used to be that there was such a thing as a liberal Republican and a conservative Democrat. And there's so few of them nowadays. So people have kind of ideologically sorted themselves into different camps. And so it's very, very clear. And so that's why everybody's at loggerheads with one another. There are a couple other theories that I have. I don't think politicians socialize well enough. So when Lindsey Graham, if you watch the second undercard debate, said that people need to drink more, I'm not advocating that people go get drunk together, but he did have a point about people not socializing in the same way that they used to. So, you know, that's part of it. And so I knew that I would kind of stand out like a unicorn, as though I didn't already stand out in this predominantly white church as a black person. So I was just like, yeah, okay, so I'm going to kind of let this go. So I think that there's some people who assume, Christians who assume that because I'm a Democrat, that I'm compromising on my faith, that I'm compromising on what I believe to be sin, that I'm going to compromise on sort of what, you know, morals are. And I don't think that that's the case. And so for some people, that's always going to be a tough sell. And, you know, God bless them, we'll figure out a way to work through it. One of the things that I think actually I personally value is I actually like being in some of these different partisan spaces because of the fact that I'm a Christian, because there's a certain knowledge that I've gained as a result of being in those spaces. I think there's certain insights that I haven't been called upon to use yet to maybe promote reconciliation, but I probably know more about Republicans than perhaps your average Democrat would, just because of the fact that I hang out with so many of them. So, and I mean, most of the stuff that, you know, I do at church is actually pretty sort of superficial at this point, but, you know, I'm not one of those people who only hangs out in circles where everybody thinks like I do. And so I value that. I think it challenges me. I think it helps keep me on my toes. I wish other people would avail themselves of those experiences.
All right, this has been very helpful. We got good professional perspective, personal perspective. Now, what we want to do is shift a little bit to questions of policy, because the goal is to mark out as much as we possibly can what Jesus has to say and how you interpret that for the context of issues in the 2015 American context. And some of these issues include things like criminal justice reform, poverty, immigration. So let's just go to criminal justice just for a second. Jesus was executed by Roman authorities after experiencing unjust trials at the hands of both Roman and Jewish authorities. What would Jesus think about the state of criminal justice in the United States today?
I think he would think that his case was different from other people's cases. So his execution was by design. It was something that he knew he had to go through. And it was a system that structurally was probably going to, you know, hasten and make that easy, but he was doing it for an entirely different purpose than the people who falsely accused him, sort of meant to kill him for. So he did it for us. He did it because we fall short. We will never live up to God's standard. We would never be able to be in communion with him had Jesus not died for us. So I think he would view his situation as actually very different from what we see today. I think if he looks at the criminal justice system today, where depending on where you live and perhaps the color of your skin, you might get targeted by police more sometimes when you commit crimes at the same rate that other people do, I think he would think that that was unjust. And I think he would look at the discussion, and I think he would probably be able to view the debates that we're currently having about criminal justice with the same level of complexity and nuance that we don't seem to be able to view it with today. So you're either pro-cop or you're anti-cop, depending on those situations. And I think that it's much more in the middle. It's a bit of both and. I think lots of people are both and, but we can't seem to find the way to have that in the public discourse. So maybe if Jesus were here, he'd be trying to facilitate that discussion more so than trying to take a side. But I don't think that Jesus would find it fair that certain people get certain types of sentences where other people don't get certain types of sentences, and that it could be based on the color of your skin, the amount of money that you have, where you happen to live.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jesus would have departed from the premise that every human life matters, and, that God created each human being and that every human being is special and unique. And I think in that way, there's a dialogue in criminal justice now that has been a little troubling because, there's this sort of notion that there are criminals and there are people who have violated our laws. And for that, I do believe that they should face punishment. And in some cases, that punishment ought to be severe. But I also believe that it is very difficult to approach the criminal justice system and the legal system in a way that starts from a place of harshness if you go back to the basic premise of kind of what Jesus believed and who he was. I'll just say, for most of my life, I've been a real hard ASS on crime issues relating to crime and criminal justice. I mean, never mind 3 strikes. How about just 2 strikes, right? I mean,
did you say hard? What was it?
Hard ASS. I didn't want to say the word. I didn't think it was appropriate in a forum like this.
That stands for active sympathizing.
That's right. Active sympathizing son of a. Anyway, it just keeps going. So sorry. So I guess that was the view I had for a long time. And actually it wasn't even after I came to faith in Jesus. It was actually after I got married, because my wife's an attorney. She spent a lot of time in the criminal justice system. Her most recent assignment actually was to reform the conditions in juvenile detention facilities in California, which were just awful. I mean, they were actually unconstitutional, and the state of California got sued repeatedly for the conditions in these juvenile detention facilities, which, I mean, it was just completely horrifying and inhumane in many ways. So it was actually through her work and her reminding me about the way that Jesus calls us to view people as people that I won't say that I've changed my views. What I'll say is that I have a greater understanding about the importance of the humanity of our criminal justice system, and recognizing that these are human beings, some of whom have committed crimes, and the characterization of people as criminals, I think, can be a little dehumanizing, and it's important to not have that kind of dialogue.
Very good. And there's a related policy issue of poverty. What is Jesus' perspective on the poor and society's responsibility toward them? What do you see as the primary differences between the parties' perspectives on how to address poverty in the U.S. today?
Well, I think Jesus addressed poverty as a community problem. And so I differentiate a community problem from a governmental problem. And I guess this may be where we differ a little bit, in the sense that I believe, first of all, I believe that the gospel calls us to care for one another. It calls us to be concerned about those who have less. And I believe as a Christian, it is my charge to live my life in that way. And so that means participating in community service activities. It means working with organizations that help those who are less fortunate. It means giving a percentage of what we are blessed to earn every year back to the community. I believe that all those things, and every Christian should believe and should act in that way. I also believe that it's those organizations and those communities that are best equipped to help and serve and lift people up. I just don't believe that government does that well. And so for me, at least, traditionally, that has meant that while I do believe that government should be there as a safety net, I do believe that there should be some provision for government to help as a last resort and to help those who are desperately in need. I do not believe that government is the answer at the end of the day. And so that leads me to a much more limited view, because I do take this view that the community and that our institutions of faith and individuals have and should bear responsibility. And I believe that at the day of judgment, we will be called to account for what we did to help others around us who weren't blessed with as much. And so I don't know, that may not be a satisfactory answer for some, I recognize that. But I just feel really strongly that, and also just sort of empirically, I think that government tends to be less effective in being the source of first help in most cases.
Thank you.
So, I mean, this is probably the biggest place where we're going to disagree. I mean, one, I am a Democrat because I don't mind a social safety net. Yes, I think they can be too big, but in general, I probably would prefer a wider safety net than Lanhee would. And also, there are places where I believe that government needs to intervene in other issues related to inequality. And so that's the main reason why I'm a Democrat. When it comes to issues of dealing with poverty, I believe that communities should be involved, nonprofit organizations, faith communities, and I think Christians in particular have a responsibility to be able to reach out to the poor. But I think that there is a problem of scale in that there are lots of churches who do some things, and some of them by choice are choosing not to engage the poor as much as they should because they don't want to, perhaps because they're motivated or blinded by prejudice. But I also think that some of these problems are so entrenched that faith communities would be overwhelmed if they actually took the responsibility on completely themselves to be able to do that. And I also think that some problems of poverty in this country are government's fault. And so if government created some of these problems, I think that they need to come in and fix some of those problems, because there are some things that you could help on an individual level. So even if churches were providing food and shelter and clothing, they are not necessarily going to fix infrastructure. So, we know that, inner city communities sometimes don't have good public transportation out to places where jobs are. That's a government sort of intervention. Government has to be involved in that. A church can't give a tax break to a business to have them locate in a community. Government has to be involved in those places. And so I don't want to exclude the private sector or the nonprofit sector or the faith community from being involved in addressing poverty. But I think government has an important role to play in those issues because they are so widespread. Also in terms of just thinking about, what I think about sort of certain issues with related to redistribution, I'm definitely a capitalist. So I know this came up in the Democratic debate on Tuesday night about, whether certain candidates were capitalists. So I definitely believe in the market system, but I believe in regulation. And so I think that without regulation, people will fall to their sin nature and be greedy and actually not take responsibility for their fellow brother or sister. And when that comes, if we think about certain things in ancient Israel, they had redistribution plans kind of set up. So if you bought land, after 50 years, you had to give it back to the family so that there would be an inheritance for somebody. If we look at the early church in Acts, it was by choice. It was an individual small, but it was a communal community. So this is not I'm against capitalism by any stretch of the imagination. I like capitalism, very much so. I probably like it way more than Bernie Sanders likes it. But I think that there is some room and some flexibility to think about the ways that government can be involved in helping to make things better.
Very good. Now, we particularly appreciate the fact that we're not talking about those emails, But along with criminal justice and poverty, the other big issue is immigration. Jesus was famous for welcoming ethnic and social outsiders and relating to them, and in some cases even healing them. How do his actions and teachings influence your perspective on America's immigration debate today?
Well, I think first of all, in biblical times, national identities were actually quite significant. And so, as a sort of basic premise, I do think that there is a certain integrity to the national unit that's important. And that means that we have laws that enforce who can and cannot come here. And I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I think that's very important, and the enforcement of those laws is important. That does bump up against a little bit the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. And what does that actually mean when you really start to unpack it? It's really, really hard, it turns out, because is your neighbor your literal neighbor, like the person that lives across the street from you, or is it the person that resides across a national border from you? And I think it's very difficult. What I do know is that regardless of where we come out on policy, Jesus would want us to treat this as a problem of compassion more than anything else. And I do think that the dialogue around immigration is where I think, unfortunately, we've reached a point that isn't productive now. And I think that the dialogue has to be one that starts from the premise that, look, these are all human beings. And as I said earlier, we have to understand that humans are created by their creator in a special and unique way. And there is something that is, I think God's heart breaks every time that he feels like we dehumanize people. And I think that's very hard about the immigration debate at the end of the day, is that we have come to a point now where it feels like we're talking about people in mass as opposed to individuals. And that's not to say that all of those individuals, are here legally, should be allowed. Whatever your view is on what we ought to do with them, that's one thing. But again, I think it is important to return to the basic premise that you have to start seeing individuals as individuals.
Good. Thank you.
I mean, I think from a policy standpoint, as far as whether or not the federal government has a responsibility for securing our borders, protecting our borders, to make sure that people who might seek to do America harm don't get in. I mean, I think that Lenny and I agree that that is government's responsibility and we should be able to do it. I mean, I think the larger question is what to do about people who are already here, particularly here, who were brought involuntarily and who have made America their home. And so, the part of the immigration debate that I find very troubling, the part that I find unchristian is not sort of this notion. Some people would argue, well, we're just trying to get people to follow the rules, and if you broke the rules, well, you have to suffer the consequences. Is that people aren't thinking about the other dimensions to the story, and thinking about what the consequences of this could be. And there is a certain stridency in some of in the tone of the language that's been used, and some of it has just been outright racist. Because when we're thinking of immigrants, we have a certain vision of what an immigrant looks like in our heads, and those are people who might not look like what we think Americans are. And I think to the extent that this debate is being motivated by fear of the other, it's wrong. If this really were about sort of following rules and putting proper procedures in place, that would be one thing, but that's not all that's going on here, and I think we have to be really honest and acknowledge that. I mean, and I think also in an age of terrorism, we also have to think about what's motivating some of our decisions. Yeah, I mean, we do have to protect the borders. Yes, we do need to be aware of attacks that could potentially happen. But especially when it comes to issues like refugee crises, I've actually been very ashamed of people who I figured would probably identify as Christians refusing to even consider the possibility of bringing Syrian refugees to the United States because they're working on the assumption that they're all going to blow up the place. And I'm like, we see these people fleeing for their lives. And I'm not saying that there isn't somebody who might have terrorist designs on the United States, sort of in that particular group. But chances are the vast majority of them aren't. People have to be vetted before they come to the United States, and people have to be held accountable and can be tracked here in the United States, not as Chris Christie suggested, but as, there are ways to sort of, watch. And I think that we might be relinquishing an opportunity to really show the love of Christ to people. Because if we're sitting, or if Hungarians or whomever are sitting around just telling people, no, 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 you can't come, and especially if some of those people do that and they represent Christ, then that's a bad reflection of Christ to people. But if people do come and they are hospitable, then that's an opportunity for us to share how our faith informs our hospitality and why we, want to reach out to people and help them. And so I think, with the proper controls and the proper vetting in place, we should be opening, we should be opening our hearts and our minds and our country for people to be able to come in and to seek refuge from a really, really bad situation.
Good. Thank you very much. And there's another policy area that's even more related to the first three, and that's race relations. We've seen this year some conflagrations in some of our cities, et cetera. So how do these same teachings of Christ influence your perspective on race relations in the U.S. as you see it now?
So the New Testament talks about not having respect of persons. And so that notion that we don't view people as being better or worse than us because of their background, I think is something that really should inform how we treat people. So I think in theory, a lot of people at least pay lip service to that, and that informs widely different policy views. So the question is, we live in a country where people have shown respect of persons based on people's background, based on people's skin color. And we are living with the consequences of that today. So the question is, okay, so we don't do any new things that are overtly and egregiously bad, but how do we deal with the residual impact of those other bad things? And then how do we deal with attitudes that actually still persist in American society today that actually inform some of these nasty confrontations that end up kind of becoming racial flashpoints that sort of demand movement responses and demand policy responses. And that's where I think people's self-interest kind of comes into play, and people don't always realize that they need to check their self-interest out the door and really sit and take on some other sort of Christian attributes and fruits of the Spirit. We think about not just being kind, but we also think about things like pride and arrogance and all of those kinds of things. So if we always go into a situation assuming that we've walked a mile in our brother's shoes, or that we know what's going on and that nobody can tell us anything, then that might be the type of attitude that informs a refusal to see such a thing as structural inequality, to even contest that it exists in the first place. It's the type of thing that might suggest that implicit bias couldn't possibly explain why Black people are more likely to get shot by police than others. So I think sometimes if we walked into certain situations with greater humility and actually sat and listened to other people, we might end up at a different policy ending point than we intended to or started off at. And then it might actually help dial back some of the tension, because part of the reason why you've seen such violent frustration and outbursts is that there are people who've just felt that their voices were never, ever heard. And so sometimes if you feel that your voice is never heard, you react in very, very sort of violent ways and sort of in very spectacular ways. So, this is one of those places where I don't think it's just, well, I don't harbor overt prejudice in my heart that's going to solve the racial problem. I think it's also a little bit of learning to stop and learning to listen. And I don't see people listening because everybody always assumes that their side has all the answers.
Chen?
Yeah, I think perspective is so important, and really approaching it with the openness that really Jesus calls us to. I often think about the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. The woman at the well. And, Jesus had, if you believed the sort of laws and norms of the time, Jesus had no business talking to that woman. Nor did she have any business talking to him, really. Imagine how she must have viewed him initially, as someone who would never even consider speaking to someone as lowly as her. And then Jesus should have approached her as some, non-human being. But for Jesus to approach her and to have that conversation and to help her realize that he was the Messiah is really such an incredibly touching moment in Scripture, when you realize how many stereotypes and how many rules Jesus broke in doing that. And it was all about perspective. That Jesus came from the perspective that he was the Messiah and he was there to save her. And once she saw that, how their sort of minds and their spirits came together. And I think, that's obviously a very special story, and that's not going to happen in every situation. But I think if we are able to approach the situation in the same way, in other words, to try to get perspective. I don't know what the right policy answer is. I'm not sure that there is a policy that can cure all of the racial tension we have in this country. I'm not sure that what the right role of government is. What I do know is that it does start with more people trying to really take perspective of those who don't look like themselves, who don't live in the same areas as themselves, and that's a real challenge and a real call. I live in a very nice part of Silicon Valley, and what does it mean to go to a different part of Silicon Valley that may not be more than 15 minutes from where I live, where probably nobody looks like me? and nobody has been blessed with the same measure of resources as I have. What is it, it challenges me. Am I really willing to do that? And then what does it mean, not just to go there for an hour on Saturdays and volunteer somewhere, but really kind of to be a part of that community? And it's not something that I've been able to do yet, but it's something that I believe I'm called to do and that I want to do. And I just think having that kind of perspective is a good place to start. And so that's where I try to go, and that's where I want to go. And I think that if more of us sort of took that teaching from Jesus to heart, we'd be in a different place.
Good, thank you. So that's a big difference, say, between Stanford and going across the highway to East Palo Alto.
Exactly,
Yes,
that's
so,
exactly what I'm thinking of.
All right, well, thank you. And our scholars really have given us a lot to think about, both from their personal perspectives, their academic perspectives, and their overview of the policy. What we'd like to do is engage you a little bit and ask you, or have you ask our presenters questions so that we are fair to everyone. We want to make sure that they're brief and to the point and addressed to either Dr. Gillespie or Dr. Chen or both. So where are my leaders? Who are we going to start? Oh, in the document. Okay, well, the document is not giving me anything. So I'm going to help you out here, okay? Let me go back to some of the things that you've said already. One of the things, of course, that is really interesting in Jesus' life is that the Romans were sort of the white people of that time, okay? They were in charge, even of the Jews. And it seems that Jesus didn't have much to say about them. He would say, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and God the things that are God, and then, of course, all of the things that led up to the crucifixion and the Romans' involvement in that. If Jesus were here today and could not just vote, but give policy advice, what would he say to our governing structure today? What is he likely to say, and in what order is he likely to say it?
He might be tempted to say that it comes back to perspective, that none of this necessarily matters, that we have these sort of really strident debates about very small issues and what sometimes are very small differences, and we blow them up into these incredible knockout, drag-out fights. But at the end of the day, Jesus was here to proclaim the kingdom of God. He was not here to proclaim Caesar's kingdom or the kingdom of the Jews or whatever else. He was here to proclaim the gospel and the fact that there was a place where all things, a place and a time where all things would be set right. And so I think he would almost sort of chuckle and say, you guys just look at yourselves for a second and think about what you're doing and realize what will happen on the day of judgment. I'm done, drop the mic, I'm out of here.
Very good, yes.
So, one of the things I think about, I remember during George W. Bush's administration, there were times when I could get really frustrated and I could make some really snide comments about President Bush in front of my mother. And one of the things my mother would always admonish me about was my responsibility to pray for President Bush. So she'd always be like, you're criticizing him, but do you pray for him? You're not supposed, you're supposed to pray for him first. You shouldn't be critical. And I think that was an important admonishment. My mother's perspective on that was that I probably should never say anything bad about the president. And a lot of the stuff that I said wasn't particularly nice about him. But one of the good things about being in an American democracy, as opposed to the Roman Republic, was that democracy is widespread. And part of the democratic process is that there are mechanisms by which I can express my discontent and my dissatisfaction. And so we have that institutionally at our disposal to be able to do. Does that mean that I need to call the president an idiot? No. Does that mean that people need to constantly question the president's birthplace, even though you've seen the birth certificate umpteen times? No. And by the way, his mother's an American, so if his mother's an American, he has birthright citizenship. I don't know why this was a discussion in the first place. There are certain types of things, but we do have the mechanisms by which we are allowed to participate in government and are expected to participate in government. So for us, rendering unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's does involve being able to vote, being able to write elected officials and tell them, I like this, I don't like that, can you do this? Being able and being willing to serve if called upon to be able to do that. And so I think as Christians, we just have to model a respectful way to do that. And so my mom was right for challenging me for, making snide comments about President Bush. But if there was something constructive that I could have said, or if I could have framed it in a constructive fashion, then I wouldn't be sinning.
Yeah, I would say too often I've found that it's like what the godly response is, and then there's like the response you want to give, which is your flesh response. And I would say that unfortunately, like 9 times out of 10, I default to the flesh response, and it's totally, it's like you're not supposed to do it, but you just can't help yourself, and it's hard. And I think that's. People who are involved in our public discourse now, I can't say I blame them, because I do the same thing, and so I think it's a really hard problem. It's
a discipline of the spirit. Now, I want to show you how awesome this audience is. In an instant, they generated 10 questions.
Wow.
This is an incredible audience. And the very first question is, should this discussion be relevant to people who are not Christian? Why or why not, in your view?
So, out of curiosity, so there's a preacher in Atlanta named Andy Stanley, second generation preacher. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him. Okay, so theologically, I'm probably more closely aligned with his father than I am with him, but he made this comment in a sermon once that I actually kind of took to heart. People can say about Christians, I completely disagree with them, I think they're wrong about so many issues, but that what he wanted for his life to reflect was that I might disagree with this person because of their faith, or I don't believe in the Jesus that they believe in, but that person acts with integrity. They are respectful in their family life. They're respectful to other people. They're the first people there to help when there's a problem. So that's what I think we can kind of take from that. And there's something, I actually really, really agree with him on this particular point. There may be people who disagree with, my personal relationship with Christ and with my faith, but if I behave as a Christian Democrat in a way that is consistent with my faith, where I'm not compromising on fundamental issues of my faith, and then I'm behaving towards people in a way that reflects the love of Christ, that reflects things like the golden rule to people, then I think that does affect you, because we're all interconnected. We are all related to each other. I believe President Obama when he says, yes, I am my brother's keeper. And so part of being my brother's keeper, part of being my sister's keeper, I do have the same issues that lots of liberals have with the framing of that program in particular. But in terms of sort of the notion of being one's brother or sister's keeper, my faith informs how I relate to other people, and that reforms how I relate to other people even in the political sphere. And so whether it's not demonizing my Republican brothers and sisters, whether it's not trying to win sort of chits when trying to sort of gain policy points, and actually working toward policy that's actually going to be for the benefit of all people and not just for the benefit of my party, that's a way that I can reflect an integrity that is born out of my faith.
I do think it's relevant in the sense that hopefully this discussion and similar discussions can show that faith doesn't have to be and shouldn't be used as a weapon in discussions about policy in the public square and public life. And I think sometimes folks who aren't Christians have an impression of Christians and how they talk about politics and how they use faith in thinking about the political square. And if anything, I think just providing hopefully a more nuanced portrait of that would be of benefit.
All right, so the next question has to do with the natural environment. What is the Christian perspective from either side of the political spectrum? We've got the Paris conference coming up on climate change. We have our Chesapeake Bay around us, things like that. As Christians, from which side or either side would you look at issues of the natural environment?
Well, I do think we're called to steward our resources responsibly. I think that's fairly clear. Obviously, there is going to be a lot of gray space in terms of figuring out what that means, how far should government go. But I think that, for me at least, I take it as a personal charge and not necessarily a responsibility for government per se. This again gets back to the individual versus government. I think that we should each individually feel compelled and called to care for the earth that God's given us. In terms of what it means for the Paris conference or for cap and trade, I mean, it's hard for me to abstract it up to that level, because I feel like when we get into these policy discussions sometimes, we really get away from the basic principle. We're talking about, well, should it be 14 credits or 12 credits? Should it be, should we be required to restrict these kinds of burners versus those kinds of burners? Those are really policy questions that I think Jesus is relatively neutral on, in the sense that he wants us to use our best judgment that he's given us to make the best decision that we can. He gave us brains and he gave us hearts for a reason, and so let's use them. But for me, at least, in terms of natural resources, it's more a question of personal behavior than anything else.
For me, environmental policy is not my specialty, so I'm not going to sit and prescribe a certain type of policy remedy, but there is a general attitude about the environment. So I think Lanhee and I agree, with creation care and that notion of stewardship. During the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Interior famously said, well, Jesus is coming back in 20 years. We don't have to worry about the environment. And the rapture hasn't happened yet. So I think we need to be responsible for the environment because, we don't know. And so I think we have to be very, very mindful of that kind of thing. But I also think that there's an attitude toward science as it relates to the environment that's also really important. I think God gave us judgment. I think God gave us brains. God has given lots of people a lot of wisdom to be able to detect things like climate change. And so I don't believe that it is some vast, left-wing conspiracy set up by the mainstream media and liberal academics to try to convince us of certain things. When we see these wild fluctuations, in temperatures where we have, extreme heat and extreme cold in places where we haven't seen it before, or where we see average temperatures increasing, if that's evidence of decisions that we're making, I think we need to do everything that we can to try to stop that. And so, I would love, I hate the impression that some Christians kind of give off, and that is sort of tied to the Republican Party, perhaps unfairly, that people don't want to sort of pay attention to science at all. And so I wish that people, would embrace empiricism a little bit more. And so given the fact that so many people have found evidence of climate change, I think we need to take that into account and actually try to do things to try to erase the damage or undo some of the damage that we've created.
Thank you very much. Well, it's interesting that before we go to the next question, that Jesus' ministry was outdoors. And so there's constant references to Sea of Galilee, mountains, streams, rivers. Virtually very little was done indoors, so that's interesting in itself. Next question has to do, now this is an interesting one. All of the Democratic and Republican candidates, according to this questionnaire, have expressed that they would consider the use of military drones. Who would Jesus drone? Great question. Aside from Judas.
Well, I don't think Jesus would drone anyone. Jesus wants to draw everybody back to himself. In cases of war, I think we have to test the legality of certain types of situations. I think there's some civil liberty issues that are involved. There's some international issues. So if you have drones flying in places where other people's countries have been giving you airspace to fly in, I think there are all of those considerations. But I think that that's a this side of heaven consideration. And Jesus is much more interested in not looking at people as though they are players on a video game than sort of their souls. So, when we see people dying in drone attacks, even if they are our mortal enemies, and in our perspective they may have had it coming, we have to think about the fact that that is a soul that might have been potentially lost. And so from the perspective of a Christian, I think what we should be doing, and this is not to say that we shouldn't be fighting ISIS, because I firmly believe that we should be fighting ISIS, and I'm by no means a pacifist. I'm probably on the Democratic side and probably much closer to Hillary Clinton on this than any of the other candidates. But at the same time, we should also be praying that the hearts and minds of people who are set to try to kill us would be changed. And that's probably going to happen supernaturally. So that's something that is actually way, way, way above our pay grade. And we should be praying that God acts at the stuff that is at his pay grade.
I just had this image of drones like over Jerusalem, in biblical times. I don't have a lot to add to that. No. Over the old city.
Thank you very much. Now, here's a question that Jesus himself would probably ask us, and one of our audience members asked the panelists, both of them, does the obligation and calling to protect your country and American life supersede the need to protect life in other countries?
That's a hard one. Jeez, you guys. No, I mean, here's what I think. I think that Jesus views, as I said earlier, I think Jesus views every human life as precious and unique. I do think also that it is part of God's plan that we are where we are, and that is also meaningful. And there is something about the community we are in, whatever community that might be, that is also unique and special. So, I wouldn't say that it's that one life is more valuable than another. I don't believe that any Christian would say that, one life is more valuable than another. I do think, though, that part of being in community and part of service to community is also, however you want to phrase it, defending that community, participating in the defense of that community. I think that is a noble thing, and so. It's hard. It's a hard issue because I don't think that it's that one society, somehow that life is more valuable than this life. Although I think in times of war and times of conflict, that can be the natural conclusion. I don't think that's the case, but I do think that these conflicts between societies, they probably predate biblical times. Such a thing is possible, and so they're bound to happen. And in those situations, I do think that the call of service can be legitimate, and it can be one that would be legitimate.
Yeah, I mean, so, I am not a pacifist. I believe in military service. I support our military troops, and I recognize that they have a responsibility and are sometimes sent to places where they may not want to go. I also think, the United States has a responsibility to help other nations around the world, and so to the extent we have strategic alliances, if you're part of the military and you're called to help defend allies, then, I think that that's definitely part of the deal. There was a lot of war in the Old Testament. Yeah. So, war sadly is a function of life in our fallen state. That's a function of sort of our capacity for sin. And I think probably the notion that we help other people, whether it's in foreign aid or whether sometimes it's in military defense, some of the military stuff is strategic. But I also think that there is something charitable and important. And so it actually sometimes really troubles me when I hear isolationists talking about how we should not be providing aid to certain countries in the world, especially developing countries that may need it. I mean, I think that is part of being generous, and I think we're called to be generous. And I would argue that might be part of the reason why America is a blessed nation, so that we're blessed so that we can help others. And so part of me thinks that sometimes some of that isolationist language is inherently selfish. Like, I understand the not getting involved in wars or starting wars that we shouldn't be starting, but then there's that we don't want to help other people when they're in need part that I actually don't think is consistent with a Christian worldview. If I had one more thing to kind of say about this particular issue, actually, I think I'll wait.
Okay, all right. I'll take that in the meanwhile. Now, interestingly enough, in the New Testament, it says after a long day of preaching, Christ would retire to the hills to pray. The modern interpretation is to chill. Okay. Now, before we allow our panelists to chill, there's one more question we want to ask them that comes from the audience. And that is, why is it political suicide for a political leader to admit that he or she was wrong on a policy or to change their position? How can this change our orientation toward our system of government?
Well, I mean, I think that's a reflection of pride. And so that in and of itself is sinful and problematic. But from a strategic standpoint, admitting that one is wrong gives ammunition to the opposition, and so people don't want to give their opponents advantage. And it's really a sad state of affairs that people are more concerned about their side gaining points than they are about getting to a policy end that's actually the best decision or the right decision. And I think we have to do a lot of reflecting about how we have contributed to that problem. So if we elect people who we know are going to be bombastic and arrogant, if we know we're going to elect people who can never admit that they're wrong, show humility and show contrition, if we elect people who do not know how to be conciliatory at all, and we do this all around the country, then we end up with the mess that we have. And so if we care about those kinds of issues, then maybe we should be looking for elected officials who reflect that type of giving, teachable, humble spirit that will actually allow them to collaborate and make decisions.
Yeah, I think the popular media and the conflict that comes with political campaigns has created a situation where people who change their minds on issues, it's perceived as a character flaw. It's the problem isn't that they change their mind, it's what does that say about them as a person? And, you know, in some cases, it can say that the person has simply acquired new information and is arrived at a different conclusion. In other cases, it can be that they change their mind for political reasons. Whatever the case might be, I do think it's unfortunate that we've come to a place in our political discourse where admitting you're wrong, it just rarely ever happens because it is seen as such a fatal character flaw. And I don't know, you know, if it's going to take like the American people picking someone someday who's like changed their mind on a bunch of stuff. I don't know what it will take to get there. But ultimately, I do think we should be a little bit more tempered in our response on these issues when people feel like they have developed a new point of view or developed a point of view that's come with, you know, some measure of education or whatever. I think we probably ought to give them the benefit of the doubt, you know, and it might start there.
All right, before we ask Mr. Jenkins to come back up, let me ask our two wonderful scholars if they have any concluding thoughts or observations they'd like to share on this conversation with the audience.
After you. Oh, okay. Well, this has really been a lot of fun for me, and I think it's not often that you have a conversation that's like this in terms of acknowledging that we start from a place, we clearly have differences, but we start from a place of similarity, and that place of similarity is very strong and very powerful, and at the end of the day is the core of my identity, certainly, is someone who follows Christ. And I think being able to start in that place is a great place for reconciliation. It's a great place for agreement that still respects our differences and still respects that we're not going to come out the same all the time, but it's great. I wish there were more opportunities to do this.
I agree. I think probably if there's one thing that I would say, it's that I love politics. I do. You know, I study it, I read about it, it consumes a lot of my day. But at the end of the day, my identity is anchored and based in Christ. And that is way more important to me than whether or not I have a D or an R behind my name, or what I feel about certain policies. And so, you know, what I would just encourage people to think about is to make sure that you think about what is actually important in these debates. So I think for people who are followers of Christ, it's your relationship with Christ that's always going to be more important than the letter behind your name. And even for those who are not Christ followers, these things are important, but in the grand scheme of life, they're not that important. They're not the things that should define us the same way that, you know, your job or how much money you have or where you live shouldn't define you. There are certain things that are way more important. So I think we should all think about the things that are much more important and, you know, care about this stuff and have fun with it, but also just put things into perspective.
Very good, thank you. And it turns out that when we think about Jesus and how he would vote, he would be a very global person too, because all the apostles got out in the world, transformed the world, etc., and they continue to do so. So can we express our endless thanks to these two wonderful scholars who've, in a very dynamic way, discussed this topic, and, you know, I think even Jesus would be proud of them. Okay. we'd like to thank you, the audience, for coming and participating and listening and reflecting and generating your questions back to us. And we also admire these two because they're role models. They really are. When you look at what they've done as young people, they're young people still. What they've done with their life and how they've done it, it's really remarkable to follow and to observe. So we want to express our thanks to them. We want to express our thanks to Veritas for organizing this, and I'm personally grateful to have had the opportunity to participate in this way. And I'll turn it back over to Mr. Jenkins.
Let's give one more round of applause to our guests.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.